There are only a few select locations where they grow along the California coast and up into Oregon a little bit. And it doesn't take long for things to petrify, not at all. Things can petrify very quickly. We've got some examples here on the table of things that petrified very quickly. I'll show you those in a second. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. Here's petrified firewood. It was chopped on before it got petrified. You can go to Southern Forest World Museum in Georgia, Waycross, Georgia. There's a mummified dog stuck inside a tree. Some people say it's petrified. I don't know if it's mummified. I've not been there yet. But anyway, how can a dog get mummified just in probably a few years? Chased a coon up the tree, got stuck. They named it Stucky, of course. That's the name for the dog. They had a contest to name it, and so they called it Stucky. They cut the tree down for firewood. There's a dog inside. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Got his leg shot off or torn off or who knows what, but there's his leg petrified. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. A petrified hammer was found from a Marine barracks from World War II. Petrified hammer. Petrified hat found in New Zealand. Here's a kid sent me this right here on the table, a petrified crayon found in Arizona. I mean, the crayon is turned to stone. We have right here a petrified pickle. It's in our museum. Well, it's here tonight, but a guy sent me this and the jar with it. The jar is still in our museum. He said, Brother Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. The house had been empty at least 30 years. But we were digging around through what's left of this house and found the pantry. And there were pickle jars in there, but the lid to one of the jars rusted, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah, of course. One kid wrote me a letter. Here's the letter right here. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 8 years old doing a science experiment. I put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they would sprout. And I forgot about them. A year later, my mom saw the bucket on the back porch. She said, get rid of that bucket and all that junk out there. He said, the acorns had turned to stone in 1 year. I have right here a baggie of petrified acorns. It doesn't take long, folks. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years for things to petrify. It's not true. A guy sent me a picture of a petrified pin cushion. The pin cushion, you can see the pins had rusted off except where you can see the rust marks where the pins had been stuck in there. Petrified pin cushion. They dug up a grave in Tennessee several years ago. They found the body of the person inside the grave had petrified, turned to stone. The doctor died and they buried him. 14 years later, his wife died. This is back in 1881. They dug a hole to bury Grandma, and water went into the hole. And they thought, oh, we don't want to bury Grandma in the water, so they buried her someplace else. And then the kids got worried about Grandpa in that moving water. It hit an underground spring, apparently. So they dug up Grandpa. He'd been in the ground 14 years. And the article says, the occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the continual flow of water. It said the arms had rotted off, but the rest of the body had turned to stone, petrified. A guy found a petrified man in Montana. He took it 5'8". The guy carried it around as a museum curiosity for years in carnivals and fairs and stuff. Petrified body of a man found on the beach in Montana, in a beach of a river. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a lady went into the hospital. She said, my side's been hurting. The lady was 62 years old. They x-rayed her and found a petrified fetus, a baby, inside. She had been pregnant. The baby almost came to term and died, apparently, and turned to stone inside her body. 62-year-old lady with a petrified baby inside. Here's the article. You can read it for yourself. I met a guy in Maryland who said he worked at a hospital, Brian Lackey, who lives in Washington, but there's his phone number. He was in Maryland. He said they brought a lady in there and took out a petrified fetus out of her body. The baby's in the museum now, or in a medical hospital up there. Petrified fetus. Here's petrified sacks of flour found in Arkansas. A flour mill flooded. The flour turned to stone. The sacks of flour were buried in water and mud and turned to rock. There's our petrified pickle right there. You can see the jar it was found in. Come by our museum at Dinosaur Adventureland and see all this. So it's true there are layers to the earth. It's also true they can form very quickly. I think the flood's the best explanation for this. Skeptics will say, wait a minute, why are all dinosaur bones found in the same layer? First of all, they're not, okay? But it is true there is a little bit of sorting to the fossils, okay? And I think there's a better explanation for that than evolution. They're only told in school this is showing an evolutionary pattern. This is pure baloney in my totally unbiased opinion. First place, the fossils are not sorted clearly like the textbook says. David Ropp said, one of the ironies of the evolution-creation debate is the creationists have accepted the mistaken notion that the fossil record shows a detailed and orderly progression. And they've gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in their flood geology. There isn't an orderly progression. If there is any progression at all, there's a better explanation called the flood. I think fossils are separated by their density, and we'll cover that in a minute. But there is no geologic column. We covered that in video number 4. They date the rocks by the fossils, date the fossils by the rocks. It's all based on circular reasoning. Moving water and liquefaction are much better explanations for the sorting in the fossil record. There are several things that happen with high velocity water in a flood moving around, swirling around the world. You get liquefaction, you get, of course, abrasion and simple erosion, and you get hydraulic plucking. Rapidly moving water creates a vacuum, and it sucks rocks right off the side. The big dam, the dam in Arizona, the Glen Canyon Dam in Arizona, they had water going through the pipes it was having flood season, getting rid of as much water as they could, and it started going too fast. And they saw it turn red as it came out the side. They said, oh, shut it down, it's eroding the sides of the dam. Within, I think, 20 seconds it took from the time that they got the message to shut the water down, scuba divers went down there, and during that, I think, 20 seconds, it had eroded an area in the side of the mountain the size of a basketball court, about 4 feet deep. Sucked it right off the side. Rapidly moving water dissolves whatever it's moving against. A process called hydraulic plucking. There's another phenomenon called liquefaction. If you go stand out on the beach, walk out into the surf where the water's about knee deep, just stand there, don't move. Every time the waves come by, the high part of the wave is heavier than the low part. There's more water. The high part is going to press the sand down. As the low part comes past you, it's going to relieve the pressure. And if you're down there with goggles looking at it, you can see the sand hopping up off the bottom. Just stand there and don't move. Within about 5 minutes, you'll be about that deep, your feet covered up in sand. And you didn't move. What's happening is the pressing and relieving of the pressure is causing a phenomenon called liquefaction. This is automatically going to sort things. Now, during the flood, you would get enormous liquefaction because just the tides. As the Earth turns under the moon, if the Earth is covered with water, the tides are still going to work during the flood, but now there's no continents to stop them. Today, the tide just gets going and then it bumps into something like South America, so all the energy is taken out. But during the flood, you wouldn't have that. Computer models tell us that if the Earth were covered with water, smoothed out and covered with water, the tides would change 200 feet every 6 hours and 25 minutes. Well, today here in Florida, they change, 16 inches. We don't get much tide here. I've been up to the Bay of Fundy in northern Canada where the tide changes up to 100 feet. It's the record, 102 feet. Anchorage, Alaska has the second highest tide in North America, 30-foot tidal change. You can see the water come rushing up and then 6 hours later start rushing back down. So you'd get a 200-foot tidal change during the flood. This 200 feet of water would do enormous things to the surface underneath called liquefaction. It would sort things. Actually, a guy took an aquarium, big aquarium one time, and he put a big hot water bottle in the bottom and poked it full of thousands of holes. And he hooked a hose up to it. Then he dumped into the aquarium dirt, rocks, gravel, sand, mud, dead fish, dead amphibians, dead reptiles, mixed them all up in a cement mixer and dumped them in. Turned the hose on, water came out through the bottom and bubbled up through this aquarium to fill up the aquarium. Of course, as it fills up the aquarium, it's going to lift the particles and then drop them again, and the denser ones drop a little faster every time. Within just a few hours of filling this aquarium, it sorted all the animals, and it put the fish at the bottom, amphibians next, reptiles next, birds on top. Automatically sorted them. Now, it would look like they got buried in that order, but no, they got sorted in that order by liquefaction. Plus, if huge areas of sand are buried under there, if something is lighter and it's buried by a heavier, denser layer on top, you can get what's called a sand plume. All of a sudden, things are moving around. Pretty soon, bloop, it bubbles to the top. And big chunks of lighter material like sand would bubble out to the top. That's probably what caused Ayers Rock in Australia. It's a giant sand plume, badly eroded today. And you can see if you get up close to it, there are millions of little tiny holes in it. It's probably a big, what's called a sand plume, where the sand just bubbled up through the heavier material on top of it. Liquefaction also causes the ground to turn like jelly. During earthquakes, like here's these buildings in Japan, during the earthquake, the ground shakes, all the water comes to the top, and the buildings just sink in. If animals are sorted at all, it's probably based on habitat. Evolutionists will say, Hovind, don't you know clams are found at the bottom of the geologic column? I said, well, first, they're not always found at the bottom. But if they are found at the bottom, generally, that's probably because that's where they live. Logic would tell us they'd be the first ones buried, right? Animals might be sorted based on habitat. They might be sorted based on intelligence. As far as anybody can figure out, clams are not too smart. It might be sorted based on mobility. Did you know clams can't run very fast? It might be sorted based on body density. Did you know clams are a little heavier than bird feathers? And birds are the last ones to drown in a flood. So if birds are found on top of the geologic column, that doesn't prove they evolved last, it proves they drowned last. Or they ended up floating to the top when they did drown. So the Bible says the high hills were covered. The earth was totally covered by a flood. 15 cubits, that's about 22 feet, over the mountains. Boy, God thinks of everything. That ark was 45 cubits, or 30 cubits high, 45 feet. So there was, if it had 50% underwater, which is pretty heavy for a boat, still couldn't scrape bottom on any mountains. They were perfectly safe in there. God thought of everything. So skeptics say, where'd all the water go? Oh, it's still here. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, the waters assuaged. That means to drop down, to sink down. Now, an NIV says the wild animals. They weren't wild animals. They were tame. And it says the waters receded. That's not technically correct. They actually assuaged. It dropped down. If we filled this room 4 feet deep in water, and then all of a sudden the floor caved in over here and dropped down 10 feet, that's going to suck all the water from there into the hole. That's what happened in Winter Garden, Florida, where the neighborhood fell in. Anybody see that? All of a sudden, about 4 houses and everything just dropped down about 30 feet. Boof. Big sinkhole developed. I think it's Winter Garden, just somewhere near Orlando. That happens occasionally around the world. Things just sink down. Well, during the flood, you'd get this sinking process as the ocean floors would drop out and the water would rush into those holes. The Bible says the water stood above the mountains. So I think during the first few months of the flood, the animals sorted out and fossils were forming. During the last part of the flood, the plates of the earth are still shifting and they're unstable, and they began to lift up or sink down different places. Thin spots sink down, other places lift up, forming mountain ranges. Water rushes off, forming erosion in a hurry. The Bible says in Psalm 104, at thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away, talking about the water. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. Now, many reference Bibles have a footnote right here, because this is an Old English phrase. What this is saying is the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. During the last part of the flood, the mountains actually lifted up. So, was Mount Everest underwater? Mount Everest wasn't there. It formed during the last part of the flood, as the mountains lifted up. So that area was underwater. That's how you explain the clams on top, but Mount Everest technically wasn't there until after the flood, or during the flood it formed. The ocean crust is thinner than continental crust. They know this from earthquakes, checking the S&P waves with kind of like doing a sonogram of the earth. They do that all the time. Thinner spots would tend to sink down. Water's going to rush in, filling in these places, causing oceans. The crust of the earth is about 30 miles thick under the continents and about 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans. And the earth all busted up into plates like that. And some are still moving. This map shows the earthquake potential of different areas. Pensacola has just about 0 chance of getting an earthquake. Now we have a chance of getting other problems, like natural disasters, like maybe hurricanes or tornadoes or politicians. But those, not much chance of an earthquake here. I think the earth crust compared to the earth is pretty thin. 30 miles compared to 8,000 is almost nothing. Kind of like a waterbed, if you push down one place, someplace else lifts up. So as the earth settled out after the flood, you would get continents forming. Mountains arose, valleys sank down, water rushed off, erosion was incredible. These pictures show the Canyon Lake Dam flood in New Braunfels, Texas, just in 2002. The water went over the top of the spillway from the flood water, and boy, it carved out canyons, washed out roadbeds in a real big hurry. Anybody who's been near a bad flood knows it doesn't take long for erosion to take place. And if you look out over the world, you can see erosion marks all over the place. I fly out west, and you look out the window, and you can see huge erosion patterns in places that never rain. Here's a Slick Rock in Arizona. Obviously, erosion did that. To me, the flood's the best explanation. When I flew from 3 days ago from Spokane, Washington, over to Seattle, Washington, you can fly over and see the Channel Scablands. It's unbelievable. There's the Dry Falls, Washington, out there. Largest waterfall in the world with no water going over it. That's left over from either an ice dam breaking, causing the Channel Scablands, or from the flood. This shows what's called the Three Gossips, the rocks formation standing up with John Wayne riding around there someplace. The textbooks are going to say it takes millions of years to form these things. And you can see the buttes and the elevated plateaus, obviously erosion. You can go see Bryce Canyon beautiful. I mean, it's basically wasted real estate, but it's, beautiful looking anyway. They say it takes millions of years to do that. Here's a close-up view of the same type of thing. You can see the little spires sticking up in the ground, off the ground. They say it takes millions of years. Oh, there's my ink pen on top. I don't think so. There's a pile of dirt we had in the backyard. After one rainstorm, I went out and took a picture of it. Made what looked like exactly like Bryce Canyon after one rainstorm. There's millions of years of erosion along a highway built a few months ago. Unprotected soil erodes quickly. This evidence of a giant lake and millions of years of erosion right here. You can see the obvious took millions of years to form that, boys and girls. Oh, there's my glasses. Another close-up pile of that pile of dirt. Close-up of that pile of dirt. It doesn't take long. You can go out to Montana and see these erosion features that are just enormous. I fly out west quite often. I just look out the airplane and look out the window and see, man, there was a flood. But see, God doesn't want people to look at the erosion of the world and think flood. He wants them to look at the erosion and think millions of years, because He doesn't want them to come to Christ. Here's some pictures of Dry Falls, Washington. Largest waterfall in the world, no water going over it. Just incredible erosion features. You can study that for yourself if you get time to look more into that. Talk about the water was 300 feet deep going over that waterfall. Niagara Falls is about 4 feet deep, the water going over. 300 feet deep, water going over a waterfall. There's an eastern Montana washout. It's interesting, most of the mountain ranges in the world follow the ocean basins. I think Walt Brown's theory is right on track, that the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the wrinkling of the pressing of the plates as they're sliding would cause all this. To me, that's by far the best explanation of all this. Bent rock layers, as you see in these pictures here, rocks don't bend very well. Bent rock layers, to me, indicate they were bent while they were soft. During the flood, you'd get thousands of feet of mud, and then during the end of the flood, you get the crust of the earth twisting and contorting, and then they slowly harden and turn to rock. I was in Crystal Cove State Park in Los Angeles, California, a couple years ago. You can see the close-ups here of these bent rock layers. We got up and looked at them real close, like with a magnifying glass. There are no cracks in these rocks. These were bent while they were all very soft layers. If they were bent after they were hard, they would fracture. They're not fractured. These were all formed quickly and all bent while they were still soft, and then they hardened into rock. As the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the pressure would cause metamorphic rock, like marble, like they make tombstones out of. That's a result of the twisting of the crust of the earth. Skeptics say, how did the kangaroos get to Australia then? I mean, if after the flood, Noah got off the ark, all the critters got off, but how did the kangaroos end up in Australia? Australia is surrounded by water. Kangaroos can't swim very well, they'll say. When Noah got off the ark, the continents were actually larger than they are today. Now, this is going to sound strange, but let me explain. The oceans were smaller because there was still a bunch of ice at the North and South Pole. If you froze a few zillion gallons of water and stuck them on the North and South Pole, that's going to lower the ocean level. This map shows England would not be an island if the water was a little bit lower. You know the deepest point of the English Channel is 150 feet? That's twice the width of this room. That's the deepest point. 30 miles wide, 150 feet deep. Do that on a graph paper to scale. It's a straight line. You could actually walk out to Ireland and to Iceland right after the flood. You can see on this satellite view showing the sunset coming into England, you can see the continental shelf. The water's not deep. As you fly into Pensacola, you can see the water's not very deep out there, folks, for quite a ways out. Between Alaska and Russia, the water's only like 60 feet deep, the width of this room. All you'd have to do is lower the water just a little bit, and everything's connected. So I think right after the flood, the oceans were smaller because the continents were bigger, because the water was trapped in the form of ice at the North and South Pole. If the oceans were just 10% deeper, this would be the beach right here. The world is basically pretty smooth, pretty flat. When I flew into Galveston, Texas, you get off at the airport, it said, welcome to Galveston, elevation 7. I thought, man, one good wave and we're underwater here, 7 feet above sea level. Not much. Florida used to be gigantic after the flood. Probably the continental shelf is where the beach used to be. You could actually walk to Cuba, jump over the creek. It could be the Gulf of Mexico filled in a few hundred years after the flood, and water came pouring in as the Atlantic filled up. It would pour in and fill in the Gulf of Mexico, carving out the grooves around Cuba. That could have happened after the flood. To me, it's a logical explanation. Mobile Bay, Pensacola Bay, generally less than 7 feet deep. Sometimes when hurricanes come and the air is swirling the right way, it'll dry up both bays. The water sucks right out. Between Australia and Vietnam, the water's only 30, 40, 50 feet deep. Not much. So if you lowered the ocean level by freezing larger ice caps, you're going to get huge continental shelves connecting everything. So kangaroos, wombats, koalas, all these less aggressive animals, getting off the ark, they're less aggressive, and they would tend to rather run than fight. So as they move out, they settle in and make a house, and then the tiger moves in. Kangaroo says, we're moving, guys. We're not going to stay by the tiger. And so they would tend to continually be at the front edge, at the fringe of the migration wave. It would probably take a few hundred years, for animals to spread out around the world. And they would continually give up their territory to the more aggressive animals. And when they get to Australia, they run out of places to go. But by now the water's coming up, and pretty soon Australia is isolated. So the reason we find kangaroos in Australia is because they were at the leading edge of the migration wave, running from the predators. And then they got trapped with no enemies. Hey, big island. It's all to ourselves, guys. Let's go have some kids and grandkids. And then they're covered up, with kangaroos over there. So it's not because that's where they evolved. It's because the flood's a good explanation for that. Kangaroo fossils are found other places, but they didn't survive in those regions. They had too many predators. So why do we have a continental shelf? I think the ice caps melting back explains the continental shelf, explains why the oceans are wider and deeper and colder from the ice melting back, absorbing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Next session, we'll finish up a little bit more on the Hovind theory and then tell you the importance of all this. This flood is powerful evidence of God's judgment on sin. And if you've not trusted Christ as your Savior, you're going to be judged in front of God for yourself, what you've done in your flesh and in your body. You'll be judged without Christ. Man, I wouldn't want that. I'm going to stand there with Christ's righteousness on me. Say, Lord, you better let me into heaven because Jesus forgave my sin. I'll cover more on that in the next session. Well, welcome to our final section of Seminar Part 6 on the Hovind theory of what caused the flood in the days of Noah and where did all the water go? And why did God flood the world? If you look at this map here, you can see Minneapolis is about 600 feet higher than New Orleans in elevation, 670 feet higher. But Minneapolis is a long ways from New Orleans. Actually, it's 1,150 miles from Minneapolis to New Orleans, which means the Mississippi River, it starts near Minneapolis, has to flow 1,150 miles, but only drops 670 feet. You can calculate that out. That's a drop of about 7 inches per mile. It has to run a full mile to drop that far. The Mississippi River is what's called a low gradient stream. It's just barely on sloped ground. Now, if you built a dam across Grand Canyon, a huge lake would fill in behind it. If you built a dam across, the lower United States, you cover a whole chunk of America. All the Great Plains would be covered. But a large dam across Grand Canyon would fill in a huge lake, and Grand Canyon had to form quickly, as we can see from the evidence. The textbooks tell us Colorado River, over millions of years, formed the Grand Canyon. That is simply not true. We cover this in great detail on videotape number 4 of our series. Grand Canyon could not have been formed by the Colorado River. The top of Grand Canyon is higher than both ends. The river enters the canyon at 3,200 foot elevation. The top of the canyon is about 7,000 or 8,000 feet elevation. Rivers don't flow uphill. That canyon was not formed by that river. That river just flows through that canyon, and canyons all over the world are like that. Grand Canyon is kind of puzzling because it loops back and forth, but it also has steep sides. Now, a looping river, meandering they call it, is typical of a low gradient stream. It's just not moving very fast normally. Steep sides indicates a high gradient stream, like the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon, and between Oregon and Washington, where the river's flowing real fast down real steep ground and it cuts a big, deep gorge. Grand Canyon has both steep sides and loops or meanders. One explanation of this is the river didn't do it. Floodwater did that as it was rushing through there after Noah got off the ark. One catastrophe can rearrange the real estate in a hurry. When I preached up in Alaska, I went to see the Carnegie area, I think Trinity Arms, I think they call it, where the big Alaskan earthquake dropped the ground down, 30 to 60 feet just in a few seconds. Just the point is, disasters can rapidly change the real estate. And Noah's flood was quite the disaster. Mount St. Helens was an example of a small disaster. My sister lives right near there. I just flew over Mount St. Helens yesterday. Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980, The mud, it started blowing out the top, but right away the north slope blew out, and all this dirt and mud and ash went sliding down the countryside about 100 miles an hour. As the mud went sliding down and the dirt went sliding down, it melted the ice caps on top. Some of it blew big chunks of ice off in other places. But this released the volcano, and steam and ash came shooting out, and it covered huge areas of Washington state from this ash. You can see the ash clouds here in these pictures as it's flying out over the countryside. People were killed, about 60 people killed by this little, which was considered a small volcano. Here's a car covered up in ash, was buried by this really boiling hot ash cloud as it came over. They found people all over dead in there, 60-some people died. You can see in the photograph here how that the ash went all the way out to cover part of South Dakota with ash from Mount St. Helens. Most of it concentrated over toward Spokane. But Mount St. Helens is considered a tiny volcano by volcano standards. Compared to Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens was nothing. But even still, Mount St. Helens taught us some amazing lessons. For instance, the mud that flowed down sorted things into layers automatically. As this hot mud went flying down the countryside, it covered up and blocked off the Toutle River Valley. You can see in these pictures here the mud flows that flowed down. Here's a semi covered up with mud, got caught in the mud flow from Mount St. Helens. This was hot mud coming out of there. Mount St. Helens blew enough material out for everyone on Earth to have a ton. It would fill a 10 cubic yard dump truck every second, 24 hours a day for 600 years. Lloyd Anderson lives up near there and has a creation ministry, speaking on creation, takes people on tours of the Mount St. Helens area. If you ever get up to Washington, be sure to look up Lloyd Anderson or see creationism.org. It's not his website, but there's a lot of stuff on Mount St. Helens on that website. This mud flowed down into the valley, blocked off the river. It also covered up big chunks of ice that had been blown off the volcano. Chunks of ice as big as a living room were blown off the volcano and landed, and hot mud went over the top. Well, a few days later, the hot mud on the cold ice made the ice melt, turned to steam. Steam expands 1,700 times and blew out steam erosion pits. Here you can see the steam erosion pits with erosion marks along the side. Some professor is going to bring his kids here 100 years from now and say, boys and girls, this erosion took millions of years. No, teacher, this took about 15 seconds. The big river system that formed about a year later after Mount St. Helens blew is talked about right here. It says, the landslide of May 18th buried the river and highway to Spirit Lake to an average depth of 100 feet. It also buried most other drainages in the 23 square miles of the upper Toutle Valley and plugged the valley's mouth. For 22 months, the water had no established path to the lower waterway. Then on March 19, 1982, an eruption melted an ice pack that had accumulated in the crater. The waters mixed with loose material on the slopes of the mountains, creating an enormous mud flow. In 9 hours, while no one watched, overnight, the mud flow carved an integrated system of drainages over much of the valley and reopened the way to the Pacific. The drainages included at least 3 canyons 100 feet deep. One was nicknamed the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle because it's a 1/40th scale model of the real Grand Canyon. See, the mud flowed across, stopped the river from flowing, lakes backed up behind it. Once they got going over the top, it cut through the relatively soft mud, just 22 months old, hadn't completely turned to stone yet, cut through that stuff like a knife through butter. It carved it out. Canyons eroded quickly. Here you can see a picture of the canyon, 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, carved in 9 hours, probably less than 9 hours. You go to bed at night, you wake up in the morning, it's there. At the bottom of that canyon is a little tiny river flowing through there called the Toutle River. I would call it a creek, but they call it a river over there. Once water starts going over a dam, erosion can take place very quickly. Any farmer can tell you that if he's ever built a dam to water his cows, and the water went over the top of the, overflowed the dam, it washed out. We have a demo we do at our Dinosaur Adventureland that shows the same thing, how water can erode quickly. This is the Little Grand Canyon picture here from Lumpkin, Georgia, near Columbus. They built a house up there, built a shed, I think is how it started. And the guy didn't put gutters on, and water came running off the shed and started eroding this little hillside back in the 1800s. Now it's a huge state park with acres and acres and acres of erosion that all started just in the last 200 years. Well, Mount St. Helens has the same thing. There are canyons there, miniature Grand Canyons that formed just in a few hours. Here's some people standing on top of the cliff looking down into this canyon. If you go down in, you can see the sides of it have layers. It's stratified into layers. This had to form very quickly. All the mud washed in there at one time, the canyon was carved out at one time. It does not take a long time for this to happen. Here you can see the very fine strata here of these layers. You can get the same thing with a jar of dirt and water. You shake it up and set it down, it settles into layers. in a hurry. It doesn't take long. And at the bottom of this Grand Canyon near where the Toutle River goes, there's a little river called the Toutle River. And if you think that little river made that canyon, you're mistaken. And if you think the Colorado River made Grand Canyon, you're just as mistaken.